Right, this is a talk based on slides that I'd made for a talk that I gave a couple of times quite a few years ago. So I think in a few places the slides are slightly out of date or have been overtaken by events, but I'll try and continue as much as I can, just delivering the way that it was originally delivered. So I started off by giving a sort of rough background to the way Berlin, or just a rough background to Berlin. This here is Berlin Mitte, which, as you might guess, is the centre of Berlin. The old Berlin Wall, i.e. the wall of 1961, is shown here in red. So the Mitte was in East Berlin. I tried to show up at the top left there just how the Mitte sort of bulged into West Berlin. I mean, that's the reason why you had these, for example, these ghost stations on the Underground Railway. You had two lines which started and ended in West Berlin, but went under the Mitte, where they basically did not stop, but went through these disused stations. Now perhaps I could just mention briefly the sort of a brief background to the history of Berlin. The city can trace itself back to a settlement on the Spree Insel, and also just adjacent to that as well, on the other side of the Spree. If you look there on the map, number 6, you can see that there is an island there, the so-called Spree Insel. That's where a settlement called Köln came into being, C-O-umlaut-double-L-N. And just to the east of that, a small fishing village called Berlin. And over time, obviously, Berlin has become the name for a much wider region. As Berlin itself became the centre for the Kurfürst, and then later the King and Emperor of Germany, the palace was actually situated on this Spree Insel, basically more or less slap bang where the number 6 is now. And when it was extended from there, it went to the west on an avenue called Unter den Linden, from the linden trees, or the lime trees, and that stretched as far as number 5, which is the Brandenburg Gate. Eventually, the Brandenburg Gate was a gate on a wall built in the 18th century. Obviously, when I say obviously, the Brandenburg Gate is the only remnant of that particular wall left. But that sort of demarks the western limit of Berlin for quite a long while, actually, up until officially more or less up until 1920. So essentially, the centre of Berlin. Well, I mean, the Brandenburg Gate up until 1920 did demark the western limit of Berlin, so that gives you a clue that Berlin really was East Berlin, as was. From the Spree Insel, you've got the Unter den Linden going one way, and then you've got the Spree Insel, and the other way you've got along the present-day Karl-Liebknecht-Straße up until Alexanderplatz, which is marked down here as number 7. There's two roads, going back to the Unter den Linden for a moment, there's two roads perpendicular to that, the Friedrichstraße and the Wilhelmstraße. The Friedrichstraße is, number 12 here is essentially more or less equal to, well, not exactly spot on, but it's in the area or the vicinity of Friedrichstraße railway station, which was a major transit point during the division of the city. It's fairly easy to get into East Berlin. There's an S-Bahn train, I think, going every 20 minutes probably. And you'd get off in Friedrichstraße. You'd have to show your passport and exchange 25 Deutsche Marks for Eastern currency, but the whole procedure didn't really take too long, so it's fairly easy to get into East Berlin. Down at the bottom of the Friedrichstraße, number 4, that's the checkpoint Charlie, where you could come in by road. the Wilhelmstrasse is to the west of that, and that was where most of the government buildings were and so on. And for example, you got down number 8, I think, marks out Potsdamer Platz, which in the old days you could look over at Potsdamer Platz, which was more or less empty, but they had a little hump there which say, okay, that was where Adolf Hitler's bunker was and so on. Up at number 10, that's the Reichstag. So the Reichstag is very, very close to the government buildings, but just manages to escape being included into East Berlin. Yeah, so I think that's probably all I need to say on that. So I've said that it was very easy to get into East Berlin by train. Obviously, the other way, a fairly obvious other way, was to take a guided bus tour, which started from West Berlin. That would go through Checkpoint Charlie, and an East German guide would get on, and basically they were all standard trip. They only actually stopped in 3 particular places. First off, they stopped in Treptower Park, which is down, I think number 14 probably signifies Treptower Park. There's a major sort of a major Russian war cemetery there and so on. So you stop off there and view the war cemetery, and then get on the bus again and just go along to the edge of Treptower Park to the Café Zenner, which was on the River Spree itself. And you could just pay there in Deutsche Marks. So there was no need on this particular bus trip. There was no need to actually exchange any currency. And then final stop was on the Museum Island, or the so-called Museum Island, which is on the north of the Spree Insel. There's about 5 or 6 museums there, depending on how you count it. But the standard stop was at the Pergamon Museum. The Pergamon Museum includes the Pergamon altar, which was a very, very major item from the ancient world. And that was ripped off the hillside by German archaeologists in, I think, about 1880, somewhere around that time. At a time when the Ottoman Empire was sort of falling apart, if I can put it like that, and they were more compliant to allowing their treasures to be sold off elsewhere. It also includes a section of the Ishtar Gate from Babylon, which is carted off to Deutschland from the Ottoman Empire in after 1900. So things were probably even worse for the Ottoman Empire at that particular time. Now it's I'd actually been on this well, I'd actually been to Berlin twice, and I'd actually been on this bus trip twice. But sometime after my second visit, I came across this book called The Observatories of the World. And one of the observatories in there is the Archenholt Observatory. And that was listed as being down in Treptower Park, and I thought, well, that's great. I've been to Treptower Park twice, and I was just totally unaware that this observatory was there. So obviously, the third time I went to Berlin, I made a visit to the Archenholt Observatory, and that was really where my interest, or where my knowledge of the astronomy of Berlin starts from. And I don't know, it's hard to say now. I think the main reason why I was unaware of what was happening was because at the time, it just was not put across that East Berlin is really representative of Berlin as a whole. It wasn't West Berlin, it was East Berlin is Berlin. And its sites and features and so on just weren't publicised as much as they are, or as much as they should have been. So I mean, it's strange really, because the Archenholt Observatory is about 200 metres away from this Café Zenner, which, as I said, I've been there twice already. It's quite strange. Anyway, so in this particular talk, I just want to talk, it's a fairly cursory talk, but just gives you a bit of a clue of the sites that would interest anyone interested in astronomy while on a trip to Berlin, enough to keep you busy for a week. Perhaps I should just talk about the actual locations of the Berlin Observatory itself, the professional Berlin Observatory. This came into being at about 1700, you know, very much in line with other observatories like the Paris Observatory or Greenwich Observatory and so on. That was originally set up in Dorotheenstrasse, which is actually to the north of Unter den Linden, just to the north. It's more or less the parallel street. That moved fairly early on down to Kreuzberg, and this second observatory is not there any longer, but it is marked by a park called Bessel Park. In short, I mean, I talked about Friedrichstrasse going down to number 4 at Checkpoint Charlie, but you can see on this map that it does actually extend a bit further south, and Bessel Park does actually lie on Friedrichstrasse. It's got Friedrichstrasse on one end and Enkerstrasse on the other end, and the location of the observatory is just down to the sort of southeast corner of Bessel Park. I mean, incidentally, Bessel never actually worked at Berlin Observatory directly. He was more associated with Königsberg, which at the time was an important Prussian and German city, but is now the Russian city of Kaliningrad. But Encke himself was director of Berlin Observatory for quite a while. Right. Right, so this is a list of the institutions that I'll be talking about. Berlin Observatory, which I've just talked about now. Potsdam Astrophysical Observatory, which is a new discipline at the time. It was founded in about 1870. And I've got these so-called amateur, in apostrophes. In Archenholt Observatory, as I've just mentioned. In the west, we've got the Wilhelm Forster Planetarium and Observatory. And in the east, in Prenzlauer Berg, you've got Zeiss Planetarium. And last, the Bruno Borgel Planetarium in Potsdam. So yeah, Berlin Observatory officially had its own building or observatory building since 1711. It was founded probably about 1700, you know, as an institution, or really at the time really it was part of the Prussian society, which is headed by Leibniz, the mathematician. I've got down here it was moved to Hallisches Tor, but as I've just said, it was on the previous slide, or on a previous slide, that it was actually south of Checkpoint Charlie. It's about, I don't know, 500 meters or 600 meters south of Checkpoint Charlie. You know, the actual location, the building is not there anymore, but the actual location is about 500 or 600 meters south of Checkpoint Charlie. It's also, actually, as I said down here, it is north of the Hallisches Tor railway station, a bit further, maybe about a kilometre north of Hallisches Tor. And it was designed by Schinkel. Schinkel is a well-known architect in Berlin. He designed many of the buildings on the Unter den Linden. Neptune discovered 1846. I'll be talking about that later. And yeah, it moved in 1913 to Babelsberg, which is in Potsdam, becoming at the time best equipped in Europe, according to this slide. And obviously that just remained so for about a few decades anyway, before this new fashion of having observatories on the top of mountains and so on. But unfortunately also after the war, several instruments were transported to the USSR as war reparations, really, and that was a feature of East Berlin. You know, they had whole railway stations being ripped up and carted off to the USSR and so on. At a time when West Berlin was actually sort of faring better with some aid in order to rebuild the city, or the western part of the city. Right, so I've jumped ahead probably unfairly. Well, I've jumped ahead straight to Johann Bode. I've perhaps unfairly missed out one or two directors since then, but as I say, this is just really a cursory view of the situation in Berlin. I could have mentioned Gottfried Kirk, he was the first director, or Johann Bernoulli III, which from the famous mathematician's family, who served as director for a couple of years and so on. But Bode's law, Bode is well known for Bode's law, which is generally accepted that he himself did not actually institute this law. But perhaps I could take a second now to talk about Stigler's law. Stigler's law essentially says that in science, no equation or no law is actually named after the person who discovered it. I mean, it's obviously a bit of exaggeration to say that applies in every single case, but it's a good guide to keep in mind. If you try and sort of construct some sort of history of astronomy or science based on a law named after someone, on the assumption that he or she was the one who actually was responsible, then you're going to end up in error a lot of the time. So I've got to shift back to talk about Johann Bode and Bode's law without just bearing Stigler's law in mind. It's called Bode's law, but that sort of implies that he was not the one who actually instigated it in the first place. So yeah, that's what it is, Bode's law. And what Bode's law really says, in essence, or stated simply, is that as you go out from the sun, the distance from the sun to a planet doubles each time. So for example, Jupiter is at 5 astronomical units, Saturn is at 10 astronomical units, and then actually this law was given a great boost actually in 1781 when a new planet, Uranus, was discovered at 20 astronomical units, which was just exactly what was needed. I've got a note down here that in 1781 Bode suggested the name for the Uranus. Again, that's probably needs a bit of qualification, because I don't think that it was discovered in Britain and by Herschel, and Herschel had seemingly decided he wanted to name it after George III, and different countries were not happy with this. Bode suggested Uranus, but I think it lasted up until about 1850 before this name was really was accepted internationally. I think up until about 1850, Britain was still referring to this particular planet as George's planet. But anyways, yeah, I've got to mention on the bottom there about the Uranographia, this star atlas of his, which an illustration is given there. I could probably just go back to mentioning Bode's law here. I've got a note here which I should have probably just mentioned at the time, that there is a gap in Bode's law which is filled, as we now know, by the asteroids, but astronomers at the time were taking this as a hint that this gap was possibly due to an undiscovered planet, and they started to get a group of astronomers together to try and search for it systematically before they were beaten to the race by Piazzi, who in 1801 discovered Ceres from Sicily. But the group did still continue, and they discovered in short period Pallas, Juno and Vesta by 1807. But it's still, after that they had to wait till 1845 before another asteroid was discovered. Right, so Bode was succeeded by Johann Franz Encke, which is a famous name in astronomy due to the first item and his discovery, or his calculation of the orbit of what is now known as Encke's comet. So, I mean, obviously that's a case of Stigler's law, although in a more obvious manner, because most people know that Encke's comet was not actually discovered by Encke in the first place. I mean, what he did actually was he made a major achievement actually, and what he did was he actually worked out the orbit of this comet. he was a student of Gauss, and Gauss had become famous for calculating the orbit of Ceres. I'd said on the previous slide that Piazzi had discovered Ceres, but then this particular asteroid faded into daylight, and it was Gauss who was able to calculate an orbit for it, such that they knew the location of the planet when it again appeared in the night sky. So Encke took Gauss's method and applied it to a comet, and he really did sort of achieve quite a lot of renown for that particular calculation. Right, so that item down there, I've got down there in 1837 he discovered the Encke gap. Again, that is actually in error. The Encke gap was actually discovered quite a bit later on, and it was named after Encke in acknowledgement that Encke himself did actually, he did actually research Saturn's rings, but he was not actually the one who discovered the Encke gap. Also, the last item, he was active in minor planet research, which is quite important, I think, for the later discovery of the planet Neptune. I mean, the planet Neptune was discovered while Encke was directing. Yeah, so I think the next slide does talk about the Encke gap. Yeah, so if you look down at the bottom there, the Encke gap is marked out. You've got the Cassini division, which is the more well-known division, the division between the A ring and the B ring. And up at the top there, you can see an indication that this Encke gap is being ploughed out by a satellite, the satellite Pan, producing a gap of, well, I think the present day calculations is slightly more than that. I think nowadays it's over the Encke gap is over 300 kilometers wide. It's probably about something like 325, I think. Also, early references might possibly refer to the Encke division, but if my notes are right, I think in 2008 the International Astronomical Union actually put in a definition of the difference between a gap and a division. A division actually separates the individual rings, the A, B, C rings and so on, and they tend to be larger as well. The Cassini division is I think of the order of 3,000 kilometers across, so the divisions tend to be quite a bit large as well. Encke, as I say, 325 kilometers, and nowadays there are quite a few gaps. I should have said that a division is a division between the rings, whereas a gap is a gap actually within an individual ring. And nowadays there are plenty more gaps known than just the Encke gap. Right, so this is a major event, and I could go on for ages about this. I'll try and keep it short. You've got the simple information down there that the mathematical calculations of the position of Neptune was formulated by Leverrier of Paris, and he passed the information on to Berlin, and these two astronomers, Galle and d'Arrest, discovered the planet on the evening of 24th of September 1846, and they confirmed it in the night afterwards, and that was the start of it, or that was the confirmation. I think I'm probably right in saying that Galle and d'Arrest managed to find the planet within about half an hour or so of the start of their observation, and found that it was an 8th magnitude object, very, very close to Leverrier's predictions. Yeah. The real problems set in when Britain tried to get in on the act and state that a particular mathematician, John Adams, had priority because he'd calculated the position in 1845 although the actual astronomical or the visual confirmation had never actually taken place, which there was a major sort of controversy about this, far in excess of what you might think on a particular, given the particular topic. And it actually went on quite for a long time. I mean, in the year 2000, I should say that the actual documents held by Greenwich Observatory on this particular incident, the actual letters between John Adams and Airy, who was the Astronomer Royal, and various other particular people, these particular letters and documents actually went missing, and they were actually found about 2000, only a few years ago, in the office of a recently deceased astronomer in an observatory in Chile. So that's given cause for a reassessment of the particular situation. And I think it's probably right to say that the current assessment is that the British claims were basically, just totally out of order. I think they played down the fact that Adams' predictions were actually much less precise than Leverrier's. They were less precise, and also Adams tended to come up with new predictions during this period, and particularly predictions that he made in 1846 tended to confuse or lead astronomers in Cambridge astray. That was seemingly where the major sort of survey took place to try and locate Adams' planet or object. And when it was reported after Leverrier's or after Berlin's discovery, Britain tried to censor a lot of Adams's predictions and just produced a single prediction he made early on, which was actually the most accurate prediction he made. Just forget about the fact that he'd actually made quite a few predictions of various precision. Just report the one most accurate prediction and try and make out that he actually had priority. So it's essentially a well-crafted lie. I mean, this was I can remember stories going way back. I remember in the early days I was at a meeting at a particular astronomical society, and the speaker was talking about this, and he said, basically he was relying on the story that Adams had reported his discoveries to the Astronomer Royal Airy, and Airy had just failed to take any notice of Adams, and it was, and therefore the Astronomer Royal bear a lot of responsibility for the failure. And this particular speaker at this particular meeting, he came and said, well, let's just face the facts here. Airy was a complete bastard. He didn't take any notice of Adams. And then when he was called to account by the authorities as to why he hadn't actually carried out this work, he just said, okay, well, I didn't carry out the work because my instruments were not up to the scratch. And the authorities turned around and said, okay, well, in that case we'll give you all this money so you can buy some proper instruments. That's the type of thing that in Liverpool we would class that as falling down the Causey and coming up with a gold watch and chain. I mean, that's not really the truth nowadays. Is somewhat different, but unfortunately not as funny. So I've got a little note there down at the bottom to the effect that LaSalle discovered Triton, the satellite of Neptune, in Liverpool just a bit later, 10th of October. I mean, LaSalle was one of the people who was a party to Adams' predictions, but he obviously he seemingly never took any notice of them, never bothered to search for the planet himself. But once the planet had been discovered, then he managed to discover Triton in very, very short order. Triton is the major satellite of Neptune. Nowadays there are a couple of smaller ones known, but they are very, very small in comparison with Triton. Triton is the major satellite. And this was really, this controversy that I just talked about, that was really put into even greater a level when a couple of American mathematicians, Benjamin Peirce and Sear Walker, came up with improved orbits for Neptune. You know, they added the probably a benefit of hindsight. You know, as so often happens, once an object has been discovered, they realise that in the past astronomers have actually noted this object but weren't actually aware of it at the time. So they could actually work back after this discovery and work out or actually be aware that there were actually sightings before then. And by using them, they were actually able to come up with their version of the orbit of Neptune, which seemingly was more accurate. But unfortunately, based on this, they came up with the so-called lucky accident hypothesis, which said that this entire thing, you know, the Leverrier's predictions and Berlin's discovery, was actually just based on it was just a very, very lucky accident, the whole thing, you know. And obviously that type of thing went down like Led Zeppelin with respect to people like Leverrier and one or two other people. But I think the lucky accident hypothesis didn't actually last too long. I mean, let's be honest about this. There is at least one good reason why people might doubt the calculations of Leverrier and Adams at the time, and that was because they both based the calculations on Bode's law. If they're going to use Bode's law, as I've just said, Uranus was at 20 astronomical units. So Bode's law says that the next planet out is going to be at 40 astronomical units, whereas in fact Neptune is only at 30. So, you know, there is a certain amount of reasoning as to why people might cast doubt at the time on Leverrier's and Adams' calculations. Possibly could add just one thing at the end. I mean, as I say, this story could go on for ages, but Leverrier himself, I talked about someone describing Urey as a bastard. I mean, Leverrier himself was probably more suited for that particular title. He eventually became the director of Paris Observatory and so on, but he was universally disliked by all the astronomers there, and they eventually conspired to get rid of him. But I mean, one reason being put forward by some commentators is that, you know, he had to put up with some sort of abuse really on whatever, or, you know, this all this situation surrounding Adams' claims, Adams' counterclaims and so on. And then on top of that, we had all this nonsense from America, and, you know, that must have at least had some effect on him, on his state of mind, to a certain extent anyway. Right, so this is Galler himself. Again, I make a note there of, he discovered the Crepe ring. I mean, he's not actually credited with actually discovering it, so that again, we go back to our old friend Stigler's law. He, before the official declaration of the discovery of the C ring, you know, both he and probably someone else and so on had actually discovered it. Yeah, this is Johann Mailer and Beer. These two people are well known for producing a revised map of the moon, and also a companion manual, or basically book relating their observations of the moon, which wasn't officially at the time connected with the Berlin Observatory. This was using the private observatory of Beer, who was a very, very wealthy person. And he had a villa up in the Tiergarten. If you can remember back to the map I had right at the beginning, Beer's villa was not really all that far away from the Reichstag, or where the Reichstag is nowadays. It's just to the west of there, almost more or less on the river. And that's basically, I think, more or less at the point where the present-day Chancellery is. You know, after the Berlin Wall was removed, that area north of the Reichstag was a lot of old no man's land, which is very, very handy for building new government buildings on. That is essentially the area where the chancellery is nowadays. And as I say, I'm fairly certain that's more or less where Beer's villa was, where their lunar observations were produced from. As I say, I also got a note there about the work they did on Mars. So we have the next director is Willem Forster. Yeah, note there about the Urania Society. This was a popular society which obviously had or as you might expect, had a astronomical section as well. I'll talk a bit more about that later on, but its observatory no longer exists today. Herman Struve. So obviously at the time I made this slide, I obviously seem to have treated him as a fairly minor character, without a photograph as well. But I've produced a photograph somewhere else in this, if I can show it. Yeah, so go back here. He was director from 1904 anyway. This was when it was based in Babelsberg. So yeah, in that particular period, prior to the Second World War, Berlin was still quite an important observatory. I should also probably say about Struve that he was a member of a well-known family of astronomers. The name crops up quite often elsewhere. Right, so this is the new Potsdam Astrophysical Observatory. Germany itself led the way to a certain extent in this new science. The names of Bunsen and Kirchhoff are particularly relevant in this aspect. They worked at Heidelberg and they were able to do research into spectra and so on. And there's a famous story which, like all these stories, is probably apocryphal, but it has it that one day they were out for a walk and they spotted a fire over in Mannheim, and they were able to analyse they were able to analyse the light from this fire and work out what elements were actually in the flames, or were actually alight. And having done that, then it's only one step further to actually analysing the light from stars and working out what elements and so on are actually in the stars. I forgot to state, actually, with respect to Berlin Observatory. Berlin Observatory is you can actually view it from the outside. I don't think you can actually go inside the grounds, but that is actually based in Babelsberg, as I said, but it's actually adjacent to Babelsberg Park. The road from Berlin, which goes across the Glienicke Bridge is well known from the Cold War days. You go across the Glienicke Bridge and that goes down to Potsdam, and that skirts Babelsberg Park on the western side, and on the eastern side, that's where you can find Berlin Observatory. Probably best to walk up from the Griebnitzer See end. But Potsdam Astrophysical Laboratory, if you were to get off the train in Potsdam station, look over to your left and you can see the Landtag building. That's the Landtag is the government of the land of Brandenburg. You go up to the Landtag building, which is on the edge of a hill, go around the back of the Landtag building and go along a little way, and you'll come to the Albert Einstein Scientific Park, which is essentially just the Potsdam Astrophysical Laboratory. And you can walk around several buildings there. You've got the building that I've shown here in the centre. That's the Einstein Tower, which is probably best known for its architecture more than its scientific value. You've got you've got the building housing the Great Refractor, which is the telescope being shown here, and you've also got the main building of the laboratory, or the astrophysical laboratory itself, and one or two subsidiary buildings which you can walk around and just have a look at them. This this refractor here, that was actually built by Repsold in Hamburg. Repsold is quite a famous name in Hamburg. There was a firm, well, the firm of Repsold actually built telescopes, but Repsold was also connected with founding of the Hamburg Observatory, which the original one was the top of the Reeperbahn. That lasted until about 1900. And if you go to Hamburg today, there is a museum ship, an old fire ship. They're called the Repsold, and that is actually named after the original Repsold, the actual original member of this astronomical family. And that was named because the original Repsold was also a member of the auxiliary fire brigade, and unfortunately he lost his life when he was fighting a fire and a wall fell on him. I'm mentioning this long story because there might be one or two people who actually know of the Repsold ship through the well-known German police series called Großstadtrevier, which features the Repsold. And in this particular series, the Repsold functions as the home of one of the characters in this series, one Dirk Mattis. Right. Right, so let this sink in. Sporer's law. Again, Sporer himself did not actually formulate this law, but it was named after him because he obviously did actually work in this area. He was one of the early members of the observatory. Anyway, he was actually doing some work in Potsdam, in some buildings somewhere in Potsdam before the actual main building of the observatory was actually built. So he's an early member. And what else can we say about this? The actual, if you actually look at the diagram down the bottom, what this actually shows is the actual horizontal axis is the time. And if you were to draw up a perpendicular line from the time, as you've got on the right hand side there, what that would show is that it would show the distribution of sunspots at that particular time. So for example, you've got the solar equator in the middle, so there's a symmetry about the solar equator. But the actual distribution, the range of latitudes between which the sunspots can be seen varies from year to year. And it varies within actually a solar cycle, which is not, the time is not actually mentioned here, but the actual solar cycle is 11 years. Or 22 years if you want to be more precise, because the actual polarity reverses. So taking that into account, the full cycle would be 22, but the seemingly obvious cycle is 11 years. So the actual appearance of the sun will vary. The corona will expand and detract during this time, but also the range of areas in which you will find sunspots does actually vary also, as shown in this diagram. Again, it's not actually mentioned on this diagram, but this type of diagram is actually known as a butterfly diagram. Right, so an early director of this institute was Hermann Karl Vogel, and what he did was he used spectra, or he detected stars using spectra and attempted to measure their Doppler shift. And you can imagine the type of speeds that he was attaining from these Doppler shifts were actually sensational by the standards of the day. And also, obviously, you can detect spectroscopic binaries as well. These are, by definition, binaries that you can't actually detect as binaries visually, but applying the Doppler shift will actually show them to be binaries. And he also attempted to analyse stellar spectra as well. So if I can jump ahead, I mean, this is a very cursory view, so we're jumping straight ahead now to another fairly famous name later on, Hertzsprung, famous for his Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. which I haven't actually included an example here. Most of you possibly know, well, not most, but many of you probably know what it is already. By this time, they're able to sort of assign or relate the different types of spectra to surface temperature. So he and Russell were making research which involved actually plotting the surface temperature or the spectra type against the luminosity of stars. And that would produce a diagram which, not surprisingly, will produce a sequence of stars which are more luminous the hotter they are. There's a fairly obvious sequence across this diagram called the main sequence. These are hydrogen burning stars, fairly stable stars, of which the Sun is one. But there are other types of stars. There are cool stars, red giants. These are very cool stars, very low surface temperature, but very bright, because although the surface temperature is very low, the fact that they are very big means that they are actually emanating a lot of radiation and therefore are very bright. And then at the other end you've got white dwarfs, stars which are very small but nevertheless are very, very hot, but nevertheless end up being fairly dim because they, although being very hot, they are very small. And he also has this excuse me, attempted to calculate the distance to the small Magellanic Cloud. I mean, this was at a time when the prevailing view appeared to be that these galaxies that you could see, M31 and so on, the prevailing view, these were just nebula inside our own galaxy. The concept of external galaxies seemed to be a very minority view at this particular time. Carl Schwarzschild, a very, very famous name for the Schwarzschild black hole. I mean, Einstein's theory had only been published in 1915, so to actually come up with a solution for a black hole within a short period is quite an amazing thing to do. The Schwarzschild black hole is a very simplified black hole, but obviously still fairly useful. It's got a defined event horizon and also got a singularity. Once something goes through the event horizon, then that particular object must hit the singularity, and obviously funny things can happen at the singularity. A more realistic black hole would be rotating. The Schwarzschild black hole is non-rotating. A more realistic black hole would be rotating, and in that case it's more complicated, this idea of event horizons. It's a bit more complicated out of the outer ranges of the black hole, and also there is no singularity at the centre of a rotating black hole. There is a singularity, which is a form of a ring, but anything that goes through the event horizons is not doomed to actually hit this singularity. So that's the type of thing that probably be of interest to science fiction writers. Excuse me for a second. Yeah, so, and I've also got to mention here limb darkening. I mean, when you look at the Sun, you're not actually looking at a single surface. You're looking at a surface of maybe about 500 kilometers width, and the layers right down the bottom are going to be hotter and therefore brighter than the ones nearer to us. If you look at the Sun at the edges, when you think about it, you're looking at it more edge on. You're still looking into the Sun for about 500 kilometers, but it's not going down so far from the actual outside limit, if you like. You're not actually looking so deeply into the Sun itself as if you were looking at it head on. So the regions you're looking at the edges are cooler and therefore will be less bright. And due to contrast effects, this will produce it'll look dark. It's like some sunspots look dark purely because of contrast. They're not actually very cool or anything. It's just this optical contrast that makes it look like the dark. Also, it was very tragic that Schwarzschild actually died in 1916 while he was fighting on the Eastern Front. Now, there's a mention here of Eros. Eros was discovered by Gustav Witt in the Urania Society, or using the observatory of the Urania Society, in 1898. I've got some information on the next slide about this, about Eros. You know, if you wanted to take all this in, you could stop this recording and take it all in. But Eros was the first asteroid, I think, to be an asteroid that crossed the orbit of Mars. Previously, you know, you had this idea that asteroids circled between Mars and Jupiter. Eros actually does cross the orbit of Mars, and further still, as we now know, it actually comes very close to the Earth. It's classed as what's classed as an AMOR, AMOR. So it comes close to Earth, but it does not cross the Earth's orbit. Not currently, anyway. But the asteroids of this type tend to be very unstable. So within a period measured maybe over hundreds of millions of years, Eros will actually enter or will actually intersect Earth's orbit, and therefore currently, or therefore not currently, but possibly become a danger to Earth itself, depending on things like how eccentric the orbit is, you know, how far, or how inclined, I should say, how inclined the orbit is to the Earth's orbit. So here I've got a few pictures of the Einstein Tower, designed by the expressionist architect Mendelssohn, and this was actually built seemingly to try and detect the redshift from the Sun as predicted by Einstein's theory of relativity. But I mean, the effect is too small to be detected by an instrument of this type. So it served its purpose as a solar observatory in general. It's quite interesting at the bottom right there, showing how it looked after the Second World War. I mean, this is actually seemingly in a very isolated location, so the fact that this area was bombed in the Second World War is quite surreal, really. So we're back to the Archenholt Observatory, which I've mentioned a couple of times already. This seems to have a property in common with the Eiffel Tower, insofar as it's set up as a temporary exhibition during a larger exhibition, but is still there. I mean, Archenholt was a leading light in the Urania Society, as I've just mentioned. But I don't know, there's ins and outs. I'm not too sure of the actual history of the Urania Society. The actual main sort of administration building got separated from the observatory, and that's for some reason seemed to lead to a decline in the interest in the astronomical section. And then in 1913, I think it was, that particular observatory was taken over by the university. So in that sense, it ceased to be an amateur institution or a people's institution. And at that time, presumably, the Archenholt Observatory was actually on hand to take over this role as a people's observatory. Next slide is the Willem Forster Observatory, and that's in the west. You know, the Archenholt, after the war, the Archenholt Observatory was in the east, so this was built as a counterpart in the west, and this is actually situated on an artificial hill formed from wartime rubble called the Insulana. You know, they use it for sledging and things like that during the winter time. But a typical building, sort of evening would involve going maybe to the planetarium on the sort of lower level, and then after you've had a bit of an exhibition there, you could then go up to the observatory on the top of the hill and spend a bit of time using your telescope to observe the sky. Incidentally, this telescope here is the actual Bamberg telescope, which was used by the Urania Observatory, used by Gustav Witt to detect Eros. But you know, unfortunately, the Urania Observatory was bombed during the Second World War, so that's where the telescope came from anyway. And in the east, you've got the Zeiss Planetarium in Prenzlauer Berg. And then finally, the final slide, I've mentioned Bruno Borgel. Yeah, you got the information there. The reason I state this is because when I was walking around the grounds of the Sicilienhof in Potsdam, I came across this small planetarium named after Bruno Bogle. The Sicilienhof is the place where the Potsdam Conference was held at the end of the Second World War, and yeah, there was this small planetarium there at the time. But I now know that since then it's actually moved. It's moved to Gutenbergstrasse in the Holländische Viertel, or the Holländische Quarter in Potsdam, but still named after Bruno Bogle. Just another point is, I know that there is an actual observatory in the very west of Berlin named after Bruno Bogle as well. That's in Starken, but I know very little about that. I've never actually been there, so maybe even when I get round to producing an upgraded version of this talk, I might include that. Might be able to include that observatory in that particular talk. But anyway, till then or whatever. Cheers.